Hi everyone, my name's Helen Aldridge and I'm the project lead for the SAFE project, or the SAFE Taskforce in Liverpool. My background is secondary deputy headship, and I currently work within a multi-academy trust as well, within the school improvement team. So I'm going to give you a brief about SAFE because there's an awful lot that you could say, but hopefully this will give you enough of a taste and a bit of an insight into the evidence-led interventions. SAFE, just so that you understand the acronym, it was bringing together mainstream schools to commission evidence-based interventions to support young people, enabling them to attend so they can fulfil their potential, and inspiring them to exceed. And the project was based around high quality evidence-based interventions in and around school, with the aim to get upstream of the educational indicators of serious violence. And those indicators are, as we know, attendance, behaviour and exclusions. So the SAFE project derived from the government's 2021 Beating Crime Plan. So obviously it was the previous government, and is funded by the Department for Education, but the Education Engagement and Serious Violence Unit, aimed at Key Stage 3 in particular. So the project didn't stray into years 10 and 11 of school, it just stuck to those lower year groups. 10 areas in England were given funding. I've listed them on the screen, with some obviously the larger northern cities there, and Birmingham and 4 London boroughs. Liverpool received its initial funding up to March 2025, and that was 3.2 million. And then we were extended for just one more year with a further 70% of the annual funding. So unfortunately, the project is due to end over the next couple of months, and we don't see any further funding coming in the same guise, certainly. The whole thing commenced with a strategic needs assessment for the city, and I'm going to go into that a bit further in a moment. But the idea was to inform the targeted cohorts, so that we could look at what interventions were going to be necessary and where they needed to be targeted. The DFE provided an extensive knowledge base from the Youth Endowment Fund and from the Early Intervention Foundation, and I'll show you a snapshot of that in a moment, with the 3 main green interventions, the green lighted ones, if you like, as mentoring, social skills and cognitive behavioural therapy. The YEF also funded the programme-wide evaluation from RAND, and that is due, it's not due to be published until this year and probably later on this year. So when I show you some impact data, what you're actually going to be seeing is a local level of impact, and I will urge you that that doesn't have the statistical robustness that the RAND evaluation will have, obviously, but it was something that we wanted to look at so that we could see trends. The strategic needs assessment was completed by the local authority, and looked at various pieces of data from the police, so looking at youth violence by arrest location, looking at analysis on weapons and victims, as well as bringing in school MIS data on everything you would imagine to be in there. So your PA, your permanent exclusions, SEN, free school meals, social care data, risks of child exploitation, domestic violence in the home, worklessness in the home, and NEAT, as well as the supporting families criteria. And the voice of the young person was also heard. That was taken from YPAS in the first instance, approximately 3.5 years ago. But looking at the time, the violent youth offender profile, what you'll see just at the top of the slide is 53% have a special educational need, 27% known to social care, 52% are persistently absent from school, 27% with one fixed term exclusion, now called suspension, and 67% being on free school meals. From that strategic needs assessment, 11 schools that served the most vulnerable children in the city were identified to form the task force for Liverpool. So the head teachers sat on that task force, along with Merseyside Police, the VRP, the virtual school, the local authority, and targeted services for young people. So then commenced half-termly meetings with an expectation of full participation, which is quite a big ask for head teachers when you're looking at 2 hours every half term in that first instance. But by establishing a term of reference, we really managed to achieve that. And what it meant was we were in the best position to determine what interventions were best for the children in the city and keep sharing that best practice. And it gave those heads an opportunity to really collaborate around the most at risk children relating to serious violence, but obviously it can talk to other school related issues as well. And really this was a beacon of good practice for co-production and has been cited since. What I should add is, in a lot of the cities that received the funding, the local authority held the money, but for Liverpool it was deemed that an external was best to hold the funds in terms of the management and momentum behind those. So that's how All Saints Multi Academy Trust became involved. The CEO became the chair of the task force. So I've just done a snapshot there of the evidence. It is an extensive booklet, but what you can see, and obviously what Ben's already alluded to, the green interventions were mentoring, social skills, and CBT or CBA. And if we proposed those interventions, they were going to be approved quite quickly by the DFE, and our theory of change would be quite rapid there. In the middle there, you've got the amber interventions, which is showing that the evidence base is less clear. So that included your after school programs, sport, and some other things. And they were quite explicit around the negative effect interventions like boot camps or prison awareness programs. So our first intervention, and one of our main ones that a lot of the spend, well, probably 50% of the spend went on, was the mentoring intervention, which we call Safe Workers. This was contracted to the targeted services for young people from Liverpool City Council. And the referral criteria was Key Stage 3, children on the edge of persistent absence or already PA, with other identifying risk factors such as social care involvement, criminality within the family, domestic violence, those sorts of things. So in 11 schools, a dedicated worker was recruited and seconded to work in the school full time. These workers could handle a caseload of around 15, and the intervention lasted from 6 to 12 months. So it was really extensive intervention that included the child, but also the family. So the worker would be based between school and home, and they would provide that wraparound care, referral, the one-to-one mentoring for the pupil. They were there to support in suspensions, liaison between the family and the school, and those sorts of things. And around 200 people were supported through that within the space of 1 year. So it just gives you an example of the reach. We trained the workers on emotionally based school avoidance as well. And just to give people an idea, the rough cost of that was about 550,000 for the year. The evidence around that indicated that there would be a reduction of behavioural indicators of violence, including behaviours really around aggression and conduct, but also improved engagement, therefore improving outcomes, academic outcomes and efficacy. From our impact monitoring, so from our local monitoring, we saw improved attendance, a reduction in exclusions, and an impact on positive behaviours. And we looked at grading across a number of domains as well. So you can see that some of the other significant changes that were noted at the bottom a lot around relationships, both with their friends and their teachers, their enjoyment of school and their well-being as well. I'm now going to baffle you with some few graphs, which I'll just flip through. But our local impact to March 2025, this is showing the suspensions, sessions lost to suspensions. The green line is the intervention cohort, and the grey line is pupils with no intervention. And if you see, that first little blue arrow was when the intervention started. And what we have identified is a steadily decreasing trend in sessions lost to suspensions for that cohort. Likewise, if we strip that down to pupils with an EHCP, again, around this peak of 5.72 in the suspension sessions, we can again see that general trend of the green line dropping down there and coming more in line with their peers. Also, permanent exclusions, probably a bit more difficult to see on a graph because, as you can see there, there's peaks and troughs. So potentially less compelling evidence. However, from the start of the intervention at 3%, this mostly decreased to around a 1% trend, although you can see a spike there in autumn 2024. And just narrowing it down a little bit more, what you're looking at on the graph there is one particular school and the impact on attendance there. So if we look at the green line and we look at that first arrow where the intervention started and where the average percentage attendance was, and you can see it was at 48% there, it off initially, and then we have seen that climb. Now, I can't obviously sit here and cite causation, and I don't have the statistical robustness for that, but that is certainly the trend we've seen. Now, that is obviously in line with the national attendance trend in terms of it has been increasing. And as the strategic attendance lead, that that data is very clear to me, but I think it's still quite compelling. And when we look at some of the other pieces, there was another school where the pupils receiving free school meals showed an increase of 4.2% attendance as well. So there's definitely little indicators there. And finally, on that intervention, just looking at those domains that were explored with the individual and the increase really across the confidence levels, the competencies around those, around educational health, family relationships and well-being overall. And really the biggest hit there is the relationships with teachers and the improvement there of over 32%. The second of our large interventions was the recruitment of ELSAs within schools, so emotional literacy support assistants. Again, this was aimed at Key Stage 3 pupils, and it was for those exhibiting emotional dysregulation or being out of the classroom and demonstrating challenging behaviour. 13 secondary schools received a fully paid for ELSA, and they were trained and received the therapeutic supervision that's necessary for ELSA by the Ed Psych team from the LA. These ELSAs would handle a caseload of around the same as safe workers, but for a much shorter intervention period, so up to 8 weeks really, but again, that one-to-one pupil mentoring. So the cost there, again, similar to the safe workers, and a large amount of young people receiving that intervention. So just shy of 600 in the, where are we now, about 14-month period that we were measuring at the time we produced the report. What actually happened was the intended reasons for referral were obviously seen, so dysregulation, anger, conflict, but what we also noticed is referrals for anxiety, bereavement and mental health as well. So that probably expanded a little bit beyond what we thought it was going to be. And I should say this falls into the social skills area of the evidence base. The ELSAs were also trained in EBSA and other pertinent issues, and we trained some primary school existing staff on ELSA, but the challenge with that was obviously the time commitment. So where the secondary schools had their own ELSA that was full-time dedicated resource, the primary schools had that conflict between whatever the day job was of the ELSA, so whether that was an LSA, a TA, whatever it was. The evidence base and the evidence impact that was initially presented to us is on screen there, addressing those skills that reduce violent behaviours, the adoption of positive behaviours, increased school engagement really in terms of attendance and attainment, and reducing disruption in class. From our own monitoring, our local monitoring, we did see some improved attendance, reduced suspensions, and an increase in confidence levels. I've just shown you there the referral focus. So these were the reasons cited on the referral form into the intervention. And as you can see, managing strong feelings was the main one, along with your emotional literacy. But as I said before, anxiety, relationships, self-esteem, those things also playing in. Again, some local data here. This is the snapshot of attendance for the ELSA cohort. Now, that cohort is the blue line, and you can see it is below the no intervention cohort, although we've still taken it with some interest as a key outcome, because just below half of the pupils referred to this intervention had 3 or more family needs. So the question arose, what would it have been without the intervention? So whilst we haven't quite brought them in line with their peers, there's still some positive data there. Again, this is the sessions lost to suspension. A more encouraging trend seen here. Don't ask me what that massive spike is that you can see at the beginning of the graph. I don't actually know, but that was the data prior to the intervention started in spring 2023. But again, you can see that blue line declining from the peak at 5.6 to 3.4 in spring 2025, which is when this data is taken up to. And some softer data really looking at the negative behaviour points. A tricky one to monitor because we were dealing with 13 different secondary schools, all with different benchmarks, different policies. But it was just interesting to see as well that there was a reduction in those negative behaviour points across schools. Again, looking at school absences, we could see some reductions there from before the intervention to after the intervention. It indicated an 18% reduction, again, just in local data. And pertinently, the confidence levels identified by the pupils were quite dramatically increased. At the start of intervention, each pupil, along with their referee, would identify their 2 objectives. So they would be distinct to each child. So it might be for regulating their emotions in class, or being able to stay in lessons more, or resolving conflict, whatever it might be, those objectives were personal to the child. The data hub was a slightly smaller cost, but actually an intervention paid for by SAFE that maybe will provide the most legacy. The SAFE project developed a data platform to allow schools to access information around pupils. And it was the information that schools identified as tricky to get, to be honest. So it was looking at an overview of the services working with the family, and had feeds from social care, from early help, youth offending, MERPOL arrest data, supporting families, and later on in the piece, probation. And what that enabled schools to do was, upon identifying a concern with a particular child, they could access the data hub to look at the picture around that child, and what it would show wouldn't show the specifics, and this was all very tightly controlled in the way of data sharing agreements. It might show there was an arrest within the family in September of last year, or father's been incarcerated since whatever date, and it would just give more of that whole family picture, or services that might be supporting the parents or other siblings within the family. We initially rolled that out within the 11 Safe Taskforce schools, and it's been live since, well, for a couple of years now. We haven't yet rolled it out further, although school police officers that supported those 11 schools were also given logins. But there are plans and discussions for the advancements of this hub when SAFE no longer exists, I suppose. And I know there's been conversations with the police and with other services, and the cost of that was 100,000 to build. And we've since done a number of presentations to different areas of the country and different government services around how that's worked. And the final main intervention was another mentoring intervention, but with some elements of cognitive behavioural approach. It's called I Am, and it is choice theory, which is built from William Glasser's reality therapy. An organisation called Liverpool Secondary Schools Partnership Foundation had a number of trained mentors in in choice theory, but they were sports mentors. So the programme was delivery of choice theory, but through the vehicle of sport. So to anyone walking in on the intervention, it might look like a combat class, but it was the talking therapy around that was of most interest, really. And that was targeted at boys mainly, who might be exhibiting antisocial behaviour outside of school. They might be known to police officers. And those boys would be in a cohort and receive 12 weekly group sessions on each programme. And there was some additional one-to-one mentoring offered. We also rolled out some extracurricular as well as community signposting and a forest school at half terms. If I'm honest, probably a bit of less success on those out of school offerings just because of the attendance, whereas when they were actually based in schools, the attendance was very, very good because the boys were in school. And we did see, again, really encouraging initial data on those. So that first graph is showing the free school meal cohort. And if you look at that second blue arrow, that's when the I Am intervention started, and we see a decline in suspensions. Again, if we filter that to pupils with an EHCP, the peak at 54% was actually when it started the intervention, and broadly there has been a reduction since. Likewise, if we look at the overall sessions lost to suspensions, you can see the yellow line there, and we can look at the decrease down to 3.5 from the peak of 4.2 in autumn 2023. We had a couple of smaller interventions as part of SAFE that people may be familiar with. An outside organisation called Girls Out Loud delivered some girls focused sessions on choices and consequences, mental health, using social media and friendships. And we really commissioned that almost in a response to the Ava White tragic murder in Liverpool. And we felt that something was needed around girls keeping themselves safe. But that was a very, very short-term intervention. And also we offered training to Senkos in school on the LCLAN qualification delivered by the speech and language therapist from Alder Hey, looking at the identification of unmet speech, language and communication needs. Overall, We have absolutely tons of the qualitative feedback. So I've just picked a few bits for you. Across the whole of the SAFE project, 93% that took part say the intervention helped them, with 83% identifying something that they'd change for the better about themselves, ranging from their behaviour, how they approach school, the choices they make in the community, with the parents echoing that and talking about behaviour at home and the child's ability to control their emotions. Head teachers, unsurprisingly, were really supportive of obviously receiving 2 extra staff, you know, a safe worker and an ELSA, and they felt that they could see this prevented suspensions, but it also improved the relationships with home, and those workers were able to almost bridge the gap sometimes if relationships weren't where they wanted them to be. But mainly pupils saying they value the one-to-one support, the person to talk to, them having a person to go to in school, which is a tricky thing for schools to offer with obviously the constraints on budgets and staffing. That's just a few little quotes, you know, that the children said. Around really, I'm just more able to control my emotions. They're the themes. I think about what tools I've been given, and I make the right choices. And also overwhelmingly, what happens when I don't have this worker anymore, you know. And one boy said, what happens to my anger when they finish? um you can see there a quote from one of the parents who talks about the behaviour at home, how as a family they felt supported, the safe worker signposted services, made referrals, and overall she isn't suspended as much. And an example of a child who would have gone from school and steal in the local supermarket, and since the ELSA intervention hadn't done that in the 2 months afterwards. We looked at a strengths, weaknesses, opportunity and threat analysis really. This was midway through the SAFE project, because we were often presenting to try to secure other funding and look at really the risk to these children when SAFE is withdrawn. And we can definitely see the strengths in terms of using the evidence base, targeting the most vulnerable, having that task force of the key people within schools, those head teachers, and it's co-production at its best. The fact that the staff were based in schools and fully integrated into schools, um, and gave the opportunity to improve attendance, reduce suspensions, reduce the potential future offending and youth violence, as well as county lines and criminal exploitation. But we also thought it spoke to the FAP strategy as well. The weaknesses are obviously the longevity of the programme. The staff were on temporary contracts, so there was always the uncertainty for schools and the risk of lack of continuity due to losing staff. And obviously when that funding ceases, which it has, or it is about to finish, and just to, I suppose, reiterate what Ben said as well, I think there's a lot of links to the new Ofsted framework, and I've put some quotes there from the toolkit. The bottom one being the most pertinent, in that schools are expected to ensure that staff are aware of the signs of pupils becoming at risk of being involved in violence, and understanding that early evidence-based intervention can be key to that prevention. But there are some other references when you look at the safeguarding, child on child, and obviously the ability to work productively with other agency partners.